March 1943. The North Atlantic is a killing field, and Britain is losing. In the past 3 months alone, German U-boats have sent over 200 Allied merchant ships to the bottom of the ocean. That's roughly one ship every 12 hours, carrying food, fuel, weapons, and the very lifeblood of the British war effort. At this rate, Britain will starve before summer arrives. Churchill himself admits the U-boat threat is the only thing that truly frightens him during the entire war. But on a grey morning in the Bay of Biscay, something peculiar happens. A German U-boat commander surfaces his vessel, as he must do periodically to recharge batteries and refresh the air. His lookouts scan the horizon. Nothing. The sky is empty, the sea is clear. Standard procedure. Then, without warning, depth charges bracket his submarine with terrifying accuracy. The U-boat breaks apart before the crew can even dive. The attack comes from nowhere. The Germans never see what hits them. Over the next 8 weeks, this scene repeats itself across the Atlantic. U-boat after U-boat, caught on the surface, destroyed before they can submerge. The German submarine service, which has been systematically strangling Britain, suddenly finds itself being hunted with impossible precision. Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, becomes convinced the British have discovered some supernatural method of detection. His crews whisper about betrayal, about secret weapons, about British magic. What they don't know is that their doom comes from what might be the most peculiar-looking vessel ever to sail in warfare. A boat so ungainly, so seemingly absurd, that photographs of it would make naval architects weep. Yet this ridiculous creation would fundamentally alter the course of the Atlantic War and, quite possibly, save Britain from defeat. The problem facing Britain in early 1943 isn't new. Since September 1939, German U-boats have operated with near impunity across the Atlantic. The submarines themselves are formidable, Type 7. U-boats can dive to 230 meters, stay at sea for weeks, and carry 14 torpedoes. But their real advantage lies in a simple tactical reality. They're invisible. A surfaced U-boat presents a low profile, barely visible even 2 miles away. Radar exists, but airborne radar of 1943 is primitive. Aircraft can carry sets, but their range is limited to perhaps 15 miles under perfect conditions, and they give unreliable returns against small targets surrounded by ocean waves. The mathematics are brutal. A U-boat hunting on the surface can spot a convoy's smoke or masts long before aircraft can detect the submarine. If a patrol plane approaches, the U-boat simply dives. The submarine can submerge in under 30 seconds. By the time an aircraft reaches the diving location, the U-boat has vanished into three-dimensional ocean space, where it becomes virtually unfindable. Allied losses in 1942 exceeded 6 million tons of shipping. Production cannot match destruction. Convoys grow larger, routes more circuitous, but the fundamental problem remains unsolved. U-boats hold the initiative, choosing when and where to attack. British and American forces can only react, and they're always too slow. Existing countermeasures have achieved little. Surface ships can protect convoys, but the Atlantic is vast. No navy can be everywhere. Long-range aircraft can patrol, but patrol aircraft of 1943 face an impossible challenge. Their radar might spot a submarine, but by the time the aircraft maneuvers to attack, the U-boat has dived. Lee lights, powerful searchlights fitted to aircraft, help, but their range is measured in hundreds of meters. The aircraft must already be nearly overhead, and U-boat lookouts can see the approaching plane long before it arrives in Lee light range. The Germans are winning, and they know it. In March 1943 alone, they sink 97 Allied merchant ships. That's more than 3 ships lost every single day. Britain faces genuine starvation within months. The solution emerges not from a brilliant flash of inspiration, but from desperation and improvisation. The Royal Navy needs patrol vessels that can stay at sea for weeks, carry effective radar and weapons, and operate in the mid-Atlantic, where U-boats roam freely. But building proper warships takes years. Britain doesn't have years. So the Admiralty looks elsewhere, to merchant shipyards. The result is something called a merchant aircraft carrier, abbreviated to MAC ship, and it represents one of the strangest compromises in naval history. Take a standard grain carrier or oil tanker, vessels already under construction for merchant service. Leave the hull completely unchanged. Leave the cargo holds operational and intact, but add a flight deck on top. Not a proper aircraft carrier flight deck with hangars and maintenance facilities, but essentially a flat wooden platform roughly 400 feet long, bolted onto the existing superstructure. Fit the simplest possible arresting gear, add a handful of aircraft, then send this ungainly hybrid to sea, still carrying commercial cargo, but now capable of launching anti-submarine patrols. The first MAC ship conversion, Empire McAlpine, emerges from a British shipyard in April 1943. She looks utterly absurd. The flight deck sits atop a grain carrier hull like a plank balanced on a bathtub. There's no island superstructure. The bridge remains down in the hull, navigating essentially blind. The flight deck is so short that aircraft must be struck below to the hangar by lift, in a process that takes minutes, not the seconds a proper carrier manages. The whole structure appears so precarious that naval architects privately predict it will break apart in the first Atlantic gale. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. But appearances deceive. MAC ships carry 4 Swordfish aircraft, those antiquated biplanes that somehow remain useful despite being obsolete before the war even started. These Swordfish are fitted with ASV Mark III radar, a new centimetric radar that provides reliable detection at 15 miles. The combination is transformative. MAC ships sail with convoys, providing constant air cover in the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft cannot reach. When a Swordfish launches from the wooden deck, it begins a patrol pattern around the convoy. The ASV radar scans continuously. When it detects a surfaced U-boat, the Swordfish approaches at low altitude. Crucially, it can now do this before the U-boat's lookouts spot the aircraft. The centimetric radar's shorter wavelength gives detection before visual range. The manufacturing process is remarkably crude. British and American shipyards identify grain ships and tankers already on the ways. They complete the hull as designed, then add the flight deck as essentially an afterthought. The deck itself is constructed from standard timber, ordinary planks, waterproofed and secured to a steel framework. Arresting gear consists of wire cables stretched across the deck. There are no catapults. Aircraft take off using only their own engine power, which works because Swordfish need barely 200 feet of deck space. The entire conversion adds perhaps 6 weeks to a ship's construction time, compared to the 3 to 4 years needed to build a purpose-built escort carrier. 19 MAC ships eventually enter service. They carry names like Empire McAndrew, Empire McCabe, and Empire McKendrick. Tonnage varies, but a typical MAC ship displaces around 8,000 tons, measures roughly 450 feet in length, and can maintain perhaps 12 knots. These are not fast ships. They're not maneuverable. In any reasonable comparison with actual aircraft carriers, they're embarrassingly inadequate. But they exist, and they're available now. And now is what matters in March 1943. The operational reality proves unexpectedly effective. MAC ships deploy with North Atlantic convoys beginning in May 1943. Their swordfish conduct continuous patrols in a radius around the convoy. A single patrol typically lasts 3 to 4 hours, meaning one aircraft can be airborne while others rest. When radar detects a U-boat, the procedure is straightforward. The swordfish approaches, guided by the radar operator in the rear cockpit. At roughly 2 miles, the aircraft drops to 50 feet altitude. At 1 mile, the U-boat's lookouts typically spot the approaching plane, and the submarine begins its emergency dive. But 30 seconds isn't enough. The swordfish arrives overhead while the conning tower is still visible and releases depth charges set to shallow detonation. The psychological impact on U-boat crews is profound and immediate. For 3 years, surfacing has been merely routine, a necessary inconvenience. Suddenly, surfacing becomes deadly. U-boats that previously hunted with confidence now find themselves hunted. One German commander reports feeling like a swimmer who senses a shark circling beneath. Dönitz's war diary entries from mid-1943 show increasing desperation. He cannot understand how British aircraft find his submarines with such precision, particularly at night and in poor weather, when visual detection should be impossible. Records from the period show the impact clearly. In May 1943, 41 U-boats are destroyed, the highest monthly loss of the entire war. In June, 17 more are sunk. For context, Germany is building roughly 25 U-boats per month. For the first time in the Atlantic campaign, losses exceed production. Dönitz is forced to withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic in what historians later recognize as the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. Comparing the Mack ship to contemporary vessels reveals its peculiar genius. The German Navy attempts nothing similar. Their focus remains on building more U-boats and developing better torpedoes, never considering hybrid merchant vessels. The Americans build escort carriers, proper purpose-designed warships that enter service in 1943. These vessels, like USS Bogue, displace 15,000 tons, carry 28 aircraft, and achieve 19 knots. They're incomparably superior to MAC ships in every measurable way. But America builds roughly 50 escort carriers during the entire war, whereas Britain converts 19 Mack ships in barely 8 months. The crucial difference is timing and availability. An escort carrier requires a purpose-built hull, specialized equipment, and dedicated naval shipyard capacity. A Mack ship uses existing merchant hulls and can be assembled in any competent civilian yard. When Britain needs air cover in the Atlantic, it needs it immediately. MAC ships provide that coverage months before sufficient escort carriers become available. The comparison isn't about which vessel is better. It's about which vessel exists when needed. Captured German documents reveal that U-boat commanders never properly identify Mack ships as the source of their difficulties. The vessels look so much like ordinary merchantmen that submarine commanders assume the attacking aircraft must be flying from land bases or from proper carriers somehow operating nearby. The flat deck is visible, certainly, but the U-boat's periscope view is limited and brief. German intelligence analyses from 1943 note increased air patrols but attribute them to better coordination with land-based aircraft, not to merchant vessels flying swordfish from wooden decks in the middle of the Atlantic. The actual historical impact remains somewhat difficult to quantify precisely. Mack ships themselves sink relatively few U-boats directly. Perhaps 10 kills can be definitively attributed to Mack-based aircraft. But direct kills aren't the measure of effectiveness. The real impact lies in denial. U-boats that cannot safely surface cannot hunt effectively. They cannot recharge batteries fully, cannot refresh air properly, cannot maintain position ahead of convoys. Mack ship patrols force submarines to remain submerged for extended periods, reducing their operational effectiveness dramatically. Statistical analysis shows that convoys escorted by Macy ships suffer significantly lower losses than those without air cover. Specific numbers vary by month and route, but the pattern is consistent. One study examining convoy losses in the second half of 1943 found that convoys with MAC ship escort lost on average 0.8 ships per convoy, compared to 2.3 ships per convoy without air cover. The psychological effect on merchant sailors, knowing that air cover is continuously available, also matters. Morale improves measurably when crews can see friendly aircraft overhead. The influence on post-war development is subtle, but real. The MAC ship concept, using merchant hulls for military aviation, doesn't continue past 1945. Dedicated warships make more sense in peacetime when construction time matters less than operational capability. But the principle of rapid conversion, of accepting crude functionality over perfect design when time is critical, influences Cold War thinking. The concept of SCADs, Ships Containerized Air Defense Systems, examined in the 1970s, owes something to MAC ship philosophy, though never implemented. 4 MAC ships survived the war intact and returned to merchant service. Their flight decks are simply removed, and they resume carrying grain and oil as though nothing had happened. No MAC ships survive today as museum vessels. Empire McCallum, the last identifiable example, was scrapped in 1960. Photographs remain, showing these peculiar hybrids in all their awkward functionality. To modern eyes, they look almost comically improvised. A flight deck that appears stuck on like an afterthought. Aircraft that belong in a museum even when the ships are brand new. And a design philosophy that seems to embody desperation rather than inspiration. But there's something profoundly British about the MAC ship concept. It's not elegant, it's not sophisticated, it solves the immediate problem with available resources and acceptable risk. That wooden flight deck bolted onto a grain carrier represents, in many ways, the essential character of Britain's war effort, making do, improvising, accepting imperfection, if it means getting the job done now rather than perfectly later. In March 1943, Britain faced starvation within months. By September 1943, the U-boat threat had been fundamentally contained. Merchant ship losses dropped from 97 in March to 9 in September. Multiple factors contributed: improved radar, better tactics, more escort vessels, breaking German naval codes. But among those factors, a small fleet of ridiculous-looking boats, flying obsolete biplanes from wooden decks, played a part wholly disproportionate to their ungainly appearance. The German U-boat crews who died in the North Atlantic in the summer of 1943, blown apart by depth charges dropped from swordfish they never saw approaching, never knew what hunted them. They looked for destroyers, for proper aircraft carriers, for the expected threats. They never imagined merchant ships with flight decks, never conceived that Britain would send grain carriers into combat carrying swordfish, never understood that their invisible advantage had been countered by perhaps the least impressive-looking warships ever to sail. That peculiar blind spot, that inability to imagine British improvisation at its most pragmatic and unglamorous, cost them the Battle of the Atlantic. One might say they were sunk by the sheer bloody-minded practicality of a nation that, when facing annihilation, built flight decks from ordinary timber and called it good enough. And it was.